series. As you know, EGROW Foundation looks for policy-oriented research and research-based policy advice. It is in this context that today we have a Nobel laureate with us, Professor Michael Kremer. I have known him from 2003 onwards, interacted with him intermittently and often, and today, after a long time, I'll be listening to his presentation. I can tell you, when I used to listen to him at Harvard or at the American Economic Association meetings, he's absolutely super good, super good. And I think we need to learn from him the analytical part, the presentation that he does, and the rigor that he brings in. It's amazing. Today's session is being chaired by our chairman, Dr. Arvind Virmani from EGROW Foundation. As we all know, Dr. Arvind Virmani was the chief economic advisor of our country and also the executive director at IMF Washington. He has worked long years in policy making in India and before that at the World Bank. He has published extensively in refereed journals. He has authored a number of books, and today he is chairing the session for the session which we are doing today with the Nobel laureate Michael Krem. Dr. Virmani, please.
Thank you, Charan, and welcome, Professor Kramer. Let me first introduce him. Uh, Professor Kramer is a university professor at Chicago and directs the Development Innovation Lab at the University of Chicago. He has been Gates Professor of Developing Societies in the Department of Economics at Harvard University from 2003 to 2020. I just read that I guess that's the only thing we really share is the PhD from economics, which I also did years ago. Anyway, Charan has already mentioned that before we started. But Professor is the winner of the Economics Nobel Prize 2019, which of course has this very difficult name of Sweriges Riksbank Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel. But we'll stick with Nobel Prize in Economics for an experimental approach to alleviating global poverty. He is also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and many other fellowships and institutions. But he co-founded BREAD, B-R-E-A-D, an interesting name, the Association of Development Economists. His work focuses on innovation, including in education, health, etc., some of which he's going to talk about. And of course, he has published extensively in the field of innovation. But what is most interesting, which I just found on reading his bio, is that he is a social entrepreneur and has worked in many practical areas, some of which I can mention. One is this vaccination and advanced market commitments, an idea which one is familiar with, but I'm sure he's going to tell you his own experiences of how it's worked. He co-founded Deworm the World, NGO, which has acted to deworm, which is a very important item. I still remember myself, I think a couple of decades ago, having deworming medicine. It's something very, very important. It is unclean water. And through this NGO called Evidence Action. He is also co-founder of Precision Agriculture for Development, which leverages digital technology. Charan, we didn't realize this, but we could have also got him to speak on digital, which we have been paying a lot of emphasis on recently. And we have an EGROW paper in which looking to India in 2050 on the way where we make digital economy a very central part of our projections for the future. But perhaps we can have you again some other time if you would like to speak on that experience using digital, because that's a very important element of the rural transformation which we envisage in India over the next 15, 20 years. And to conclude, Professor Kramer is also serves as scientific director of USAID's Development Innovation Ventures. So he it's amazing. I think the bridge between theory and practice is quite surprising. One of the best I have come across in my practical experience. To a minor extent, I have also bridged the theoretical and practical divide, but Professor is amazing. So over to you, Professor Taylor.
Oh, thank you so much. I'll just bring up my slides, but thank you for that very kind introduction. And I will try to touch on some of those points. Just see if I can get the slides up.
Noble, all right.
Okay, getting it? We've got a screen. I guess you have to now choose the slide.
Yeah, I'm just having a little bit of trouble
It's okay.
navigating to
Take
the
your
slides.
time.
Oh, there we go.
I
That
think-
looks like.
Okay, coming up. Yeah, we're getting the slide screen.
I think this might not be the right version. Let me just
Yeah, you
get
have to
some assistance. Hold on one second.
Yeah.
While the professor is getting ready, I'm going to make a request to everyone. We are 200 people on the, and then we have many joined on the YouTube. Please keep your microphones on the mute mode so that we have the advantage of listening to the professor seamlessly. Thank you.
Okay, we got the slides, but I guess you'll have to start the slideshow. Right, we are on top and we can start it. We don't need the side. I guess you could just start the slideshow. That will be slightly better, but it's okay if you want to go like this.
Sorry, I'm back.
Yeah, we've got
view.
the screen, but if you can start the slideshow from the top somewhere.
Yes, exactly. I'll do that.
Yeah, okay, that's better. Yeah, we are seeing both, but that's all right.
Oh,
So
you're seeing my notes? Okay, let me try
yeah,
to
I'm
fix
seeing
that.
we are seeing your notes. It's okay, but it depends on you what you prefer.
Is that better?
Yeah, okay, that's perfect.
Right. Sorry for the technical problems. So thank you very much for the introduction. It's very generous, and I'll try to. You mentioned a few different topics, including vaccines and advanced market commitments. I'll just say a tiny bit while I've still got this title slide up, but happy to discuss many of those other topics in Q&A. The topic that I'll focus on today is exactly the point that you brought out on the interaction between theory and practice. And I've addressed this some from the academic point of view, arguing about what the benefits are for theory and for economic understanding of engaging with practice. Today, I'm going to address this from the opposite point of view, from the point of view of policy and of innovation in particular, and argue that the innovation, one of the points I'll be making, I'll try to make a number, but I'll argue that from an innovation funder point of view, that there are actually benefits to engaging with development economics research or economics research. But I hope I'll make some other points as well. So, and this work very much grew out of work as a funder of innovation at USAID's Development Innovation Ventures. So this really started out as I say to Sharon in the beginning. This started out as really a government report, and thank you for the comment about rigor. There'll be only so much rigor that we can get with our data here, but we are trying to move this literature, which had been a great literature, up at least half a notch in rigor. so let me say a couple more preliminaries. First, I wanted to acknowledge my co-authors, Sasha Gallant at the CRI Foundation, Olga Rostopchova, who's here at the University of Chicago, and Milind Thomas at the Asian Development Bank. Let me also acknowledge Esther Duflo, because some parts of this talk grew out of a paper that we wrote together in 2015 on which innovations scale. And I think I see that I don't have this on my title slide, which I should fix. But I wanted to also add on the disclaimer that I'm involved with Development Innovation Ventures. I helped co-found the program within USAID, and I'm still scientific director. So I don't want to hide that that connection. Okay. So I'll and I guess in addition to talking about some results on this, at the end of the talk, I'll try to say a little bit about just very practically, if this will be a reasonably academic paper, but I'd also be very happy to talk, and we'll say a few words about some lessons to take away if you're a policymaker thinking about starting a social innovation fund, or if you're an innovator who's trying to look for funding or areas for or assistance with evaluation. Although, okay, so let me start with the very big context, which is I think there's a widespread recognition that science and innovation are the key drivers of economic growth. And I think most economists would agree that they're also important for addressing many other social challenges. We're seeing that right now with COVID-19. Scientific discovery has been critical to addressing our health. At some level, some people might see technology as part of the cause of our environmental problems, but further technological change could also be a very important part of the solution. And I think sometimes we think of technology progressing on its own, but in fact, there's a complicated and ever-changing set of institutions that societies have created to encourage science and innovation. And that ranges from everything from government-funded research to academic research, often supported by governments, to innovation driven by the private sector in going for the market. And some of that is in turn influenced by government policies, IP policies, but also regulatory policy and other policies. And those institutions are constantly evolving in response to social needs. And we're developing new ones. And whether that's changes to IP systems to reflect different priorities over time, whether that's the development, for example, of the peer review system, which was a relatively recent innovation, but obviously now very widespread in science. So within that context, I'm not going to focus on the straight science aspect, although I'd be happy to talk about advanced market commitments later as one other institution to shape science and innovation, and to try to direct it more towards certain human needs that are not where might not have sufficient private incentives. But what I'd like to talk about today is investing not in the science side of this, but on the innovation side, so slightly applied, slightly downstream. And there have been many recent initiatives to promote innovation in international development. So I'll focus on international development as well, although I think there's some lessons for other areas. As I'm within development, you can think of a lot of things that are focused on science. Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has done a lot in health. They've done grand challenges, there's the CGIAR system, and obviously there are efforts of national governments in, for example, in agricultural research. The Green Revolution came up earlier, as well as many private sector efforts. There's social science research. An example of that would be the World Bank's SEAF Fund or their Gender Innovation Lab. And then another area is impact investing, social entrepreneurship. And two that I would mention here would be Omidyar Network or Skoll Foundation, but there are many, many other examples. So we're we're going to try to start out by addressing two empirical questions based on data from one innovation fund, DIV, but I hope the results will be more general. First one is development innovation a good investment? Is this just a fad, and we have a lot of immediate needs? Should we be directing our funding to those immediate needs, or should we be investing in innovation? And in particular, in innovation aimed at development. And then second question gets into, if we should do that, how should we do that? How should we invest? Which types of innovation are most likely to scale? So it started out with that empirical aim, but as we got the results, what I'm working on now with co-authors is sketching the model that's consistent with the results. And I think that can shed light on how to structure social innovation funds to complement private investment. So let me start out with some background, just as an outline. Background on USAID's development innovation ventures. I'll take this first question of, is development innovation a good investment? Second question of which innovations scale, and then sort of summary of model, maybe I should say sketch of the model and its implications. And then on way forward, at the end, I'll try to say a few practical tips for people working in this area. Actually, let me go back and get in one point, which I'd like to make. If I think about these three types of innovation, scientific R&D, social science research, impact investing, there's a long tradition in economics, going back to Grolica's, but many more recent papers, trying to assess the returns to scientific research. So a good example of that would be recent papers on agricultural R&D. And they find very high rates of return, often 60%, 70% rates of return. There's literature on health which finds similar things as well. There's much less research on the second two, on social science research or on impact investing and social entrepreneurship. So let me this talk will try to shed light on the second and third rather than on the first. Okay. On some background on development innovation ventures. Sorry, let me just, I think what I'd like to do, let me just actually start with something a little bit more general, which is on the methodology before I dive into the details of DIV. So the question we'll be asking, the first question will be, does the return on innovation investment exceed the return on other development investments? And here, a lot of the information that's currently available is anecdotes that by people who either by the organizations that, the annual reports of different innovation funders, and they will tell anecdotes of success, and there's certainly some impressive ones. And then there's a few, probably less, but there's a few skeptical takes that point to some spectacular failures. But of course, with just some examples of success and failure, it's hard to answer this question of, is this a good investment? Moving up maybe one level of rigor, there are some papers that have tried to do counts. This many investments, this many succeeded according to some criteria. And often what they find is that it's only a small fraction that succeed, And so some of these are skeptical takes. I'm going to argue that accounts may miss the mark some. I don't want to claim they're not informative, but I think we need to go beyond that. I mentioned this literature on assessing returns to scientific R&D. It's going to be a somewhat harder question to look at social science RCTs and social entrepreneurship, at least with our data from this innovation fund, because it's open across sectors. So if you're looking within agriculture, we know roughly how to put a financial value on the increased agricultural output. There can be many, many difficult questions. There are questions of environmental impact, social impact, but at least we know how to get started. It's much harder for general social entrepreneurship or social science RCTs because some of the things we only have very partial information on the benefits. So we're going to develop, insofar as there's a methodological innovation here, it's really developing a bounding approach, and we'll apply this to the early portfolio of DIV. So the question, why would a bound be useful? Well, if we're asking the question of, is this a good investment, then we're really saying, are the discounted benefits of the innovation investment greater than the cost? Well, the benefits are the number of people reached times the net benefits per person. We won't be able to get that for all of the innovations that we'll look at, but we'll be able to do that for a subset. We're going to be careful to include only the share of benefits corresponding to the share of innovation investment. So, often 5 different funders will fund a particular innovation, and they'll all put it in their annual report. But if you add up the obviously there's an aggregation problem if they're all counting the full benefits and claiming credit for that. So we'll try to, if DIV put in 20% of the funding, we'll try to just put in 20% of the benefits. Obviously, that doesn't get at the counterfactual. Maybe one funder was more critical than another. I don't think we'll be able to tackle that problem here. The issue is that for many individual innovations, there'll be difficulties estimating the benefits. There may be conceptual issues. Suppose in health, they've come up with this concept of disability-adjusted life year or quality-adjusted life year, and then you can try to convert that to a dollar value using WHO estimates of what's a good buy in health. Lots of things to quarrel with, but at least there's a methodology. But many other things, let's say this is an innovation to reduce gender-based violence or to reduce vote buying. Well, there's no way to there's no established methodology for that. In other cases where there's established methodology, there might be limitations of the data. And one thing about innovation, which is critical, is that it's really a cumulative process. Very few innovations are born fully blown. They evolve over time, and they're refined, and they're adapted for different contexts. But that often means that even if you have a credible impact assessment, the form of the innovation which scales may be tweaked, so it may be hard to get a credible impact assessment. And finally, innovations often take time to scale. You can think of things like some tech innovations scale very quickly, but many other take many decades to see their full impact. And we don't know the future. So what the approach we'll take here is a bounding approach. I'll put that in quotes. I don't want to claim this is a completely, technically this is a complete lower bound. But I think it's plausibly a very conservative estimate. And the idea is to take advantage of something that is true, and this will be a central point of the talk, that the distribution of benefits is likely to be extremely skewed. That's often the case for all types of scientific innovation. All all types of science, all types of innovation. If you're a private venture capital firm, you know that most of your innovations are not, that's not where you're going to get the majority of the return. What you're hoping for is to invest in one Google, one Facebook, and then you'll make plenty of money, even if a lot of your investments don't turn out to do so well. So that means that it's possible to compare the benefits of a subset of high-scale innovations to the cost of the full portfolio. And then we'll try to use conservative assumptions in some other cases. So we'll argue that we're able to get a bound on this by comparing the benefits of a subset to the cost of the full portfolio. Obviously, a downside of bounds is we won't be able to do comparisons across sectors. This is the return in education, or that's the return in health, or across different funders. Okay. Let me before I try and go back on my slides, I'm going to describe the DIV a little bit, the particular funder whose portfolio we're analyzing. But let me really emphasize that I think the lessons are broader. So the one thing to note is that the background is that we'll cover the early portfolio because it takes time for innovations to scale. This started in 2010, so we'll look at the 2010 through 12 portfolio. So I'll describe how the program worked at that time. And it differed from many other innovation funders, say from grand challenges that the Gates Foundation has, for example. It's quite open. It's open across sources of innovation. So this could be academic supply, and it could be social entrepreneurs. It's open across sectors, so it's not limited to education or health. It's open across geographies. It's a U.S. government program, doesn't fund things in Cuba, some other political restrictions like that, but quite open across geographies within the low and middle income countries, and it's quite open across scaling approaches. So funded both things that were intended to scale commercially and things that were intended to scale through public sector adoption or philanthropic adoption. There's another aspect of this is fairly broad definition of innovation. This includes IT and includes other gadgets, if you will, but it also includes new business models, ways to use insights from behavioral economics to improve social outcomes. It's very wide, and to being so wide, how's there any discipline to this? Well, the idea is to very much marry two things that some people sometimes think of as at odds with each other, which is innovation with a commitment to rigorous evidence. And in particular, in some ways, this grew out of my experience working on evidence, on experimental evaluations, on randomized controlled trials, which were, at some level, stage 2 of the process that we support. But it's very important to have a broader innovation. Requires more than that. It requires piloting of new ideas before you ever get to the stage of where a randomized trial or formal evaluation is appropriate, or I should say, let me just say where something like a randomized trial would be appropriate. And then even after something has been rigorously shown to work, and perhaps be cost effective, lots of additional work is needed to transition that to scale, to think about how would you adapt this for particular implementers, how do you change processes so that it can work at scale. So the stage 1 at the time was up to $100,000. Stage 2, I think, was up to $1 million. Stage 3 was theoretically up to $15 million, but DIV never made an award in that level, and since they've scaled that back. The program, as I'll come back to this later, the program continues to exist. If you'd like to get information on it, you can look at, we just had our 10th anniversary. this website. And if you're interested in applying, definitely encourage you to check out the website and think about it. People who are associated with the program aren't allowed to provide feedback in advance, but it's a fairly easy application form. And once that's submitted, then if it gets through that stage, then staff can engage. Okay. Let me describe a little bit the selection and investment process, because again, this was a little bit different than many other innovation funds. Actually, let me just go back and draw a little bit of a contrast. There are many mentioned that there are many innovation funds that sort of are focused on a particular sector, a particular geography, and I think there's an important role for those. There are also some that are focused on particular scaling approaches. So, impact investors might look for things that will scale commercially. There are other funders, for example, some of the things within the World Bank that would fund things intended to be adopted by governments, but typically they would ask for sort of a separation between the implementer and the evaluator. They'd want the government to already be putting in money. They might not fund sort of initial piloting that might take place when it's just at the idea stage. Okay, there were some other factors, some of these not deliberate at all, that affected how things work. So if you talk to venture capitalists, a lot of venture capitalists, at least their pitch will be that they don't just provide money, they provide a lot of technical support, advice, linkages. They argue that a big part of their role is adding value in ways other than financing. And many impact investors try to do the same. In this case, because of these restrictive procurement rules, which were quite restrictive at the time, it was much more like government procurement, typical government procurement, where proposals came in and then got evaluated by the I was going to say by the team, but actually let me say a little bit more about that as well. There wasn't a lot of active solicitation or co-creation during that period. Things have changed a bit, and now there's a much shorter initial application form, and after that there can be some engagement of the team. I was going to say that this was judged by the team. It was judged by the team, but with a lot of peer review, including peer review in the decision process. And a lot of that brought in a lot of development and economics researchers, but also brought in professional investors. There was staff input, but there wasn't skin in the game. It was the proposal that came in from the innovator rather than what I understand some venture capital firms would do, or what I think the Gates Foundation or some other big foundations now do, where a staff member sort of writes the proposal that goes up. On assessing the potential for scale, we did that, but a lot of the emphasis was pretty, we looked at cost, we tried to put in some minimal, is this politically feasible? But we were pretty flexible on team composition. So in venture capital, people are often looking for management experience, not always, in addition to technical experience. We were quite flexible, and we funded people who were graduate students, postdocs, as well as people who had more management experience. For innovations designed to scale through the public sector, we didn't say there has to be matching funds from the country government or separate implementer and evaluator. Okay, that's sort of abstract. Let me try to be more concrete. And there were a variety of types of innovations that were funded. Here's, and I'll just highlight a few of them, but this will be the list of the 43 initial awards, if you want to get a more general sense. So this first one that I've highlighted was latrines that would go in urban slums, and the idea was they would use the human waste for manufacturing fertilizer, for energy generation, and that they would try to make this a for-profit business, but with a social mission. There's another one that I've highlighted. This was actually a nonprofit, but they were trying to develop a device, a physical object that they were doing research and development on, a hand washing device. There's another, a couple of others, some for-profit, some non-profit. This was a bicycle tire that they were trying to use, which wasn't subject to puncture. But there are also some things that came more out of the RCT world. Let's see. And there are some, yeah. So some more examples will come up later of those. I should have indicated one here, but didn't. Okay. The okay. So I've now with that, I think we can. I've already told you about the methodology. Let me see if we can start applying it. So the basic idea is we're not going to be able to get measures of benefits for all 43 of these. Instead, we're going to first look at how many of these scaled. Scale's not a sufficient condition for benefits, but it's probably a necessary condition. And what you see here is an example that you see whenever you look at innovation, which is a very skewed distribution of outcomes. In this case, the outcome measure isn't our ultimate object of interest. It's not benefits, social benefits, but it's the number of people reached. And you can see that of these, there are 41 different innovations, 43 awards. Some of them got a second award during that period. 2 of them did so. But you'll see the majority of these didn't reach 1 million people. I guess now some of these, I would argue, still had quite substantial benefits, reaching hundreds of thousands of people relative to the money that was invested. But I'll focus on the ones that were over 1 million people. Now, many of the ones that were over 1 million, we don't have, and those are the ones in blue, we don't, for one reason or another, we haven't, at least at this point, been able to quantify the social benefits. But the ones in red are ones where we're able to do that. So let me sort of review some of the things that did scale, and particularly the ones, I'll give a couple of examples of things where we can try and put some sort of financial value on this. Oh, let me say, also just show, this shows the growth over time and the number of people reached. So you can see that this is growing over time. I don't expect this will continue indefinitely. Obviously, everything's going to flatten out and eventually decline. We're not using the steam shovels that were developed in the Industrial Revolution anymore. We've moved on to other technologies. But the question is, are the benefits over this period greater than the costs? Okay. But one other thing I'll note is that you can, this also shows you the skewed distribution in terms of reach. Okay. Here are some innovations with more than 1 million users. The first one was software for community health workers. And that was largely in India, but also in other countries. There's a number of randomized evaluations of this. We'll take one of them, which suggested that there are many dimensions of benefits, but one of them where we can try to quantify things is increasing the rate at which mothers deliver their babies in facilities rather than at home. Hackett et al. Found a 17% increase in that. This does require some assumptions, but if you make some assumptions about the impact of that on mortality, and you take WHO, they wouldn't call it the value of statistical life, but if you use sort of value of statistical life approaches there, then you can get a benefit number. I'll come back to that. There was a voter report cards. This was Abhijit Banerjee and Rohini Pandey were both involved in this in the evaluation. But there was there's a organization which is selling glasses. And there's I'll say a little bit more about this, but this is also perhaps unsurprisingly, some of the things with the very biggest reach were in India and South Asia, more broadly. There was a study of tea pickers that found a 22% increase in productivity once people got eyeglasses. Okay. Here's some others. I'll talk more later about the ones in red. Okay. I should note, I made the disclaimer earlier that I'm involved with USAID. I should actually add the disclaimer that I was involved not in this grant, which was for scale up. It was a stage 3 grant. But I was involved in earlier research, which wasn't supported by DIV on the dispenser program, and which I'll describe more later. And okay, so let me give an example. To give a few examples to give a sense. Here's one that is not a big contributor to the total, but this was an work by Dhaliwal and Hana. This was digital attendance monitoring, and they found that doctor-attended births increased by 16%. There's a catchment area of 2.5 million people. DIV was the lion's share of the investment, and you can calculate the benefits from this. This was not directly scaled up, although under Modi's government, I know there have been some efforts in related efforts in this area of attendance monitoring. Okay. Here's another example: dispensers. This was a $5 million investment by DIV. How do we get to the benefit side of this? Well, RCT on the impact of water treatment on child mortality. This particular program was evaluated, gave a estimate on mortality. We'll use half of that, and that turns out to be very high benefit level, 225 million. So very high return on this $5 million of investments. Okay, this is eyeglasses. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. DIV was a small share of this, so it's a relatively modest share of the overall benefits. When we add up 5, I won't go through the details of it, but happy to come back to it. We go through the benefits. If we just look at 5 innovations, we can compare the cost of the full portfolio to the benefits of these 5 investments. Well, the cost, we'd estimate at $16 million. You have to make some estimates on administration costs. The benefits, are quite conservatively estimated. Figure is 281 million just for those 5. So that means that a lower bound on the benefit cost ratio is 17. Okay, I would note that dispensers are a huge share of this, but even if we take them out, the benefit cost ratio is clearly passes any test of whether this is a good investment. So which gives some indication this wasn't just one lucky break. It looks like there's a high return. There's at least the potential for high returns for these types of social investment funds. I'll come back to, I think there are lots of reasons to be skeptical of this. I'll come back to it and try and think about modeling this. But it looks like there's at least the potential for high return, and that was realized in this case, especially because there's so many excluded benefits. Future benefits are all excluded. 4 of the 9 innovations with the highest reach are excluded. Innovations reaching less than $1 million, and we don't do a very good job of accounting for externalities here. And I think you could always argue maybe there were some negative externalities we didn't catch, but because this is a government process, there was environmental review, gender review, so on. So many of these are health innovations on communicable disease. that would, or on traffic accidents, for example, that would quite likely generate positive externalities. Okay. So it looks like, so the true benefits are benefit cost ratio is probably considerably larger than 17 to 1. So that's sort of the first result. Second question was, okay, so maybe you want to do this. Can we figure out which innovations are most likely to scale? We could get a higher return if we could somehow in advance say, well, those 30 innovations that were less than that didn't reach that many people, we just won't fund those. We'll only fund the ones that are going to scale. Well, is there any way to do that from ex ante? It's obviously easy to say that afterwards. And let me note that this is an issue in the field. So, clearly many commercial innovations scale. We can think of so many things that were developed, cell phones, for example, that was developed commercially, then went on to be of tremendous benefit to the poor worldwide. But there is a question over whether impact investing or social entrepreneurship that's aimed specifically at the base of the pyramid, does that really scale innovation to serve the poor, or does it really not that successful, or only successful if you move up market? Well, there's a great literature on this. It's often subjective analysis of innovations which scaled. So they find the sort of winners, and then they say, what do they have in common? But the success factors are identified ex post. So you often have things like, they really knew their customers well, and they developed their innovation in a way that indicated that, or they had a very good management team. And those may be very valid points, but it's a little bit hard to tell, because if you're analyzing this after the fact and you see that something succeeded, then particular eye clinic scaled really well and is serving huge numbers of people at very low cost. Well, you're going to conclude that the management of that eye clinic was very good, and they really knew their customers. So it's hard to it would be nice if we could find something that would be predictive based on characteristics at the time of the submission of the proposal, or at the time of the award. So we'll limit ourselves to that, which I think has some is tougher, but I think has some methodological advantages. So let me start with, and this was I felt I learned a lot from this analysis, having worked with DIV for 10 years. There were some things that surprised me. So one piece of conventional wisdom in the field is that is that pilots never scale. We get all these pilot programs, they're Pilotitis. And this is, and if you look at this from a count basis, it looks like there might be some justification for this view. Only 17% of the pilots went on to reach more than 1 million people, higher for the things that went into testing. We only have one data point of a stage 3, but that one scaled. Overall, I should say, I didn't focus on this before, but I do want to mention, this was a 22% rate of scaling overall. 22% of the innovations went over 1 million people. I think the sector as a whole, it's much lower, actually. So there's a effort to put together something called the million, I think it's some count of things that went over 1 million. I think they've looked at found 80 out of 2,000, more than 2,000 things that were funded. So that's a much lower rate, more like 4%. And 9 of those came from here. So it's so there may be something about DIV that contributed to, maybe we got lucky, maybe there's something about that produced a higher success rate. Okay, but in any case, if you look at the data, you might think, well, pilots aren't scaling as much. But let me show you another way of looking at the same data, which is, what if you compare this to the money that was put in? Well, these $100,000 grants are much cheaper than the $1 million or $5 million grants, and so if you look at the people reached per dollar spent, that actually, and I don't want to overplay this, that actually looks better than the ones for the later stage grants. I wouldn't play up that it looks better, very little data here, but there's certainly no reason to think it's worse. So, pilots may actually be a worthwhile investment. Here's some other things. This is, univariate analysis, small data set, obviously not causal, but I think nonetheless, suggestive at a minimum. Things with a unit cost of less than $3 were much more likely to scale. If you're selling to the base of the pyramid, and if these are often have some social purpose, because this is a public funder, people don't have a lot of money, and they don't have a lot of money for some things that serve a social purpose. It's important to keep it inexpensive, and that's true. Some of these were implemented by governments to scale, but governments also they're more likely to scale things that are inexpensive. Somewhat associated with that, some innovations were the idea was to scale this by setting up a new distribution system. So the bicycle tire, they were going to sell these bicycle tires direct to consumers. Other innovations, the idea was to scale through adoption by some existing large organization that already had its own distribution network. So for example, if you think about the software for community health workers, well, there's only one customer for that, which is the governments that are running the community health worker programs. But the advantage of that is that you don't have the customer acquisition costs of selling to each consumer by, you make one sale and then somebody else handles distribution. There are pluses and minuses of that, but if you're but it does look like there was much greater scaling for things that were not trying to build their own distribution network. I think that's because if you're selling a product which costs $1 or $2, the customer acquisition costs loom very large relative to your price if you're and your profits if you're trying to set up your own distribution network. Okay, I mentioned the link between theory and practice. So, these last two columns, these are things that are very correlated with each other. We can't independently distinguish them. But was there an earlier randomized controlled trial conducted with a treatment group and a comparison group along the lines of a medical randomized controlled trial? Or was there a development economics researcher involved? Both of those, there's often a view that involving researchers and academic research slows things down, that they'll want to, test everything to death and not move forward quickly, and that this will get in the way of a customer orientation. It really doesn't, there doesn't seem to be any support for that view if you look at these raw, these statistics. Things were actually much more likely to scale if there was a previous RCT or if there was a development economics researcher involved. Why is that? It could be a treatment effect. It could be that since most things scaled not by selling to individual customers who are not going to read an RCT, but they scaled by selling to a government, or by selling to a large business. So one of these was something to reduce traffic accidents, and insurance companies started to require it for coverage. They may well be interested in the results of something like that. So it could be that it could be the result doing the test had an effect on scaling. A second hypothesis is that it wasn't that, but it was just the people with good innovations were happy to get them tested. The people with bad innovations shied away from that. A third possibility is that, which I think we should seriously consider, is that actually the process of research was actually useful in developing the innovation. And I think economists don't tend to think of themselves as they think of themselves as involved in policy. What are the arguments for lower or higher tax rates or for different forms of taxation? But they don't necessarily think of themselves as involved in innovation. But of course, in many other fields, if you're a biologist, or if you're a computer scientist, it's very common for people who are involved in scientific research to then realize there's a practical application and then start a startup and go ahead and pursue that. Funders, many universities, it differs. Different universities have different attitudes, but at least in the U.S., most universities now encourage that in these fields and have whole processes for this, and of course try to get their cut of the profits. And the federal government in the U.S. Encourages this as well. So I think we're seeing, it varies, of course, across parts of economics, but I think there are some parts of economics where, and including some areas of development economics, where people are increasingly becoming innovators themselves. I think that partly comes from a change in development economics. That means more development economics researchers are spending time in the field, close to the customer, so be it, if you to use that language, and because they're constantly testing things and adapting them and getting the feedback from seminars with saying, are you sure? Isn't there a problem with this argument? Have you tried this? Have you tried that? I think those are actually conceivably could contribute to the research, not just to the research process, but to the innovation process. Obviously, we can't prove that, but I think some of the examples are consistent with that. Okay, here's a multivariable regression with lasso. It's some of these same variables come up. Okay. So what's an explanation for these results? Because they are surprising in a couple of ways. First, I think a lot of economists, their prior would be governments aren't very good at doing this, investing in innovation. Sure, they should support basic research, but let's let the private venture capitalists do things, and they know what they're doing. And governments are just going to mess things up. And even philanthropy, maybe philanthropy is going to get it wrong as well. Another reason why these results are somewhat surprising is DIV departed from the conventional wisdom for a lot of venture, in the venture capital sector. Let me throw out a sketch a model that could perhaps explain some of these results. While being very consistent with the idea that the private sector knows what it's doing and is not sort of making mistakes. So imagine that innovators have some private information on the private and even social return to their innovation. Investors have less information, but they can invest in information acquisition. There are obviously a lot of commercial investors in there, and many of them are highly skilled and obviously they're highly motivated. Their own money's on the line. So they're looking for, venture capitalists are looking for privately profitable innovations. I think, even though I'm, been involved in this effort, I think it's the public sector investors are less nimble in some ways. We have to go through procurement processes for very good reasons, but we have to go through them. There's environmental review and other reviews. We're not obviously not paying the salaries that venture capital firms pay. So I think that would create, I think many economists would be concerned, and frankly, I'm concerned about the risk that social investors would suffer from a winner's curse, that they would, not get the good innovations, they would get the lemons, or that they would, if they fund something, they're displacing commercial investors because they're offering grants, for example, rather than demanding a return. Okay, so that's the model. Let me add, why these positive returns and why these correlates of scaling within that model? Well, the distinction comes from the objectives. The commercial investors are providing private returns. That actually leaves an arbitrage opportunity for socially motivated investors in a particular area, in an area where there's low expected private returns, but high social returns. Now, we can think of lots of observable characteristics of an innovation that investors might look at that would move private and social return in the same direction. Is it technically feasible? If somebody comes up with a perpetual motion machine, the private return to that will be low, the social return will be low because it's not going to work. But there are some things that actually might negatively affect the private return, but positively affect the social return. So a few examples of that. Oh, sorry, the layout of the slide didn't come out exactly right. One would be if there's low barriers to entry. So for example, if something is very early stage, let's say it's a pilot, well, often the firm that develops, pilots something and does the first crack at the new technology, they may not be the one to successfully commercialize it. If you're a commercial investor, you're very worried about that possibility. If you're a social investor, at some level, you might not care as much. There's something that Warren Buffett calls a moat, which is the advantage that the firm will have if it succeeds to keep out competitors. For private, Warren Buffett's a very successful private investor. Looking for a moat makes a lot of sense as a private investor. If you're a social investor and you invest in a new home solar system, well, if the firm that you invest in develops a new technology, but doesn't manage to commercialize it super successfully, and 4 other firms are better at marketing, they take the same thing, they replicate it, and they scale to hundreds of millions of people. That's a huge win for a social investor because the solar energy device got adopted. So that's an area where that may make sense for, that's one example where social returns and private returns move separately. Another case would be, the involvement of the researchers or of the RCTs. That may make it easier for others to replicate this. That's desirable for social investors, not for profit-seeking investors. In another case, I noted that many of the things which scaled required somebody else's distribution network. A proprietary complementary asset, which somebody else has market power on. That means you need to share rents with the owner of the existing distribution network. So the firm that developed this software for community health workers, I'm going by economic theory here. I'm not making a statement about this particular case. Maybe I shouldn't. Just to be clear, I don't know the terms of their transactions with the government of India, but I have to assume that the government of India or other governments, they tried to get the best price they could in these deals. That means that the full rents from this development of this innovation won't go to the firm that developed the software. And plus, at some level, the government can then turn to other suppliers for this. If they see that this works, they're not reliant on one supplier. Other software firms can come along. Another case so that will be something where the social value is much greater than the private value because the government appropriates some of the social value or the citizens of the country because the government's acting on their behalf. There are other cases where, let's say it's a health product against a communicable disease, like something providing safe water. Well, then there's health externalities, the individual benefits, but so do the neighbors who don't get the disease. So that's another case where the inventor or the entrepreneur, the social entrepreneur, won't get the full returns. That might be another case where there'd be an arbitrage opportunity. The venture capitalists might not go for it because there are limits on the returns to the social entrepreneur, but that might open up an arbitrage opportunity for an investment fund that's aiming for social returns. So, you can think of this type of diagram. There's this huge area on the right, upper right, which I do want to, emphasize is probably the majority of innovations out there. These are things like low-cost motorcycles. That's launched they're just made, by motorcycle manufacturers. They're just trying to make a profit. They're not trying to do this as a social entrepreneurship exercise. These are, I think a lot of firms in China and India, but it's launched these whole new industries that are employing many people in Africa of motorcycle taxis. Mobile phones, another example. They weren't developed for low-income people. They're developed for high-income people, but eventually they've been adopted by low-income people with huge benefits to society. Okay, so that's a very important area, but we may not need social innovation funds to go for that. If they go for that and they make a bunch of money, fantastic, but they may be at a disadvantage in finding the next Uber relative to many other venture capital firms. Okay. There are other areas, of course, where they're profitable but might be bad for society, like alcohol and cigarettes. That's not going to be an area that social impact investors will want to invest in. There are these other areas of things that are neither profitable nor socially useful because they just don't get adopted very much. A water pumping device that was supposed to be a toy for children. Children don't want to pump water as a recreation. That's hard work. That's an actual example, often cited as example of the excesses of this field. But there are two areas in red that I'd like to highlight. The first area, area B, these are things where there's maybe a substantial R&D cost, but once they're developed, they can be sustained on a profitable basis. So, for example, a new vaccine. Or software, certain software, low production cost once it's developed. Okay, there's also area C, which might be just much harder to ever make money from. The water treatment dispensers, probably will fall into that category. The voting technology, if there's something to reduce voter fraud, a new reporting system, it's hard to see that it involves pictures of the polling station, of the count. That's hard to imagine making a lot of money from. Okay. So if you believe this sort of typology, if investors realize that that a lot of things are being sold to them as both publicly and both socially valuable and commercially valuable, then they have to ask, are they really in area A? If so, fantastic. Or are they in area D? And why did the venture capitalists pass on it if indeed it was profitable? If you see something where there's a strong case here's why the private investors are not going to fund this, but why the social value is nonetheless high, maybe those invested in those is where the arbitrage opportunities are. Okay. What other implications then do you have for the design of social innovation funds? Well, there may be other things that generate social value in excess of the private value. And these are examples, when I had discussions of these, I remember talking to a venture capitalist, who's very successful venture capitalist, about did it make sense to provide feedback for rejected applicants? And my default assumption was that if you apply to the NSF or if you submit to a journal and they reject, they send you the referee reports. It was, why would you do that? It's extra work. They might complain, argue with you, they might sue you. And he didn't say this, but there's also the danger that they take those ideas and then they compete with somebody you did fund. There's no reason why a private investor would do it. But if you're trying to add social value, even you would want to provide this feedback because maybe they'll try again and succeed with another funder or come back to you with a better proposal. External peer review. So venture capital firms do this, but there's always the danger that the ideas will leak to a competitor. Well, if you in academics, this is very, very common. And I think it also makes sense if you're trying to maximize, you'll do more of this if you're trying to maximize social value rather than private value. Same with researcher involvement, same with support for early stage innovations. Even openness across sectors. If you're a venture capital firm, okay, there are a few top firms that everybody wants to go to. After that, a lot of the firms are quite specialized. We're supporting, things in a particular area of solar energy or a particular area of biotech. Well, there's a reason for that, which is if you're one of hundreds of venture capital firms and you get an innovation, you don't know how many, you're really subject to the winner's curse. How many other venture capital firms have they tried and have turned them down? Well, maybe they knew something that you don't know. Well, if you develop expertise in a particular area and you say, well, only fund in that, then you've got less of a winner's curse problem. Much less of a problem for a social innovation fund, where there just are not that many funds competing to do what DIV was doing, which was to make grants. What's the conclusion of this talk? I'll say a few more words about just, practically, if you're interested in this field, but to sort of conclude the sort of paper part of this presentation. There's a very skewed distribution of innovation reach. So that means that the right way to analyze this is not to look innovation by innovation, was this a success or was this a failure, but to look at the portfolio as a whole. And when you look at the portfolio as a whole, you have to go beyond counts. You have to look at the returns to those, the approach that we use here and think could be used more broadly is to look at the benefits of the subset of the most successful innovations and then compare that to the cost of the full innovation. That'll obviously give you a bound, but I think because the impact is so skewed with the minority of awards accounting for the majority of the benefits, it may still be a useful technique. And in this case, it was enough to see this was a very good investment. And I think it suggests that there are high returns to this type of investment, or the potentially high returns, if structured appropriately. And many governments around the world are interested in supporting this. Governments, philanthropies, even corporations, the corporate social responsibility laws in India. I think this is actually a very exciting sector. It suggests we may be able to achieve tremendous social impact through innovation, innovation tied to evidence. We find that the innovations are much more likely to scale if there was low unit cost, if there was involvement of if the scaling strategy involved pre-existing distribution networks. Some exceptions to that, but generally that seemed to work better. And involving researchers in doing this rigorous testing seems to be helpful. I think it'd be very useful for other programs or funders to try to use this type of methodology. And if we develop this across sectors, across different funding programs, we could see which of these lessons tend to generalize and how much, and I think that would be very useful. Let me turn just to say a few words about very practical implications for a few different audiences. Sorry, let me just see if I can find my notes. First, some of you, the talk has been oriented in some ways to people who want to be innovation funders, arguing, A, this is a worthwhile enterprise, and B, that you might want to structure this not in a way that says we're going to duplicate what venture capitalists are doing, but rather in a way that says we're going to take into account what they're doing, which is very important, but we're going to try to design to look for the arbitrage opportunities of the things that they're not fully supporting. So I think that's, to any of you who are policymakers or who work for innovation funds, I think it's worth considering establishing this. To some of you are economists who may have ideas for innovations, or maybe, I don't know who's in this talk, some of you may be tech innovators or other innovators or social entrepreneurs. You might be interested in these results as well. If you're one thing you may be interested in is finding an academic partner to work with on developing innovations. There's a host of them out there. Let me just mention a few. Sorry, my notes are on the other screen. Poverty Action Lab, which is run through MIT, but it's really a network, includes many academic researchers. I used to be at Harvard. There's something called EPOD there. University of California system. Sorry, this is going to be told towards the US where I'm more familiar. Center for Effective Global Action. We're starting, I came to Chicago in part to start a new center here called Development Innovation Lab. And the idea of the Development Innovation Lab is we're going to work with partners to establish partnerships between researchers and practitioners, which we hope will be long-lasting partnerships, because we really do see innovation as a process of continued testing, refinement, scaling, but then further refinement with its own testing. I see evaluation as like not something at the end of the process, but as like A/B testing as part of the innovation process. So we'll try to identify, pilot, test, and help scale development innovations. So if people are interested, happy to connect you with people at the lab here. But there are many other. I don't want to. There are many other great academic teams. But then let me finally turn to those of you who are looking for funding, because I know there are going to be social entrepreneurs out there, or economists, or others in policy places who are looking for funding. GIV, as I mentioned, is open. There's the French have just set up a new innovation fund with some I think is in the same inspired in some ways by multiple things, but in part by the DIV example that Esther Duflo is leading, called FID. Encourage you to reach out there. There's some World Bank things, and then there's multiple private things like Skoll or Omidyar that fund things. There's the Global Innovation Fund. So there's a group of funders out there as well. I think it's exciting to that. Very happy to discuss this, but I think it's exciting from both a scientific point of view, from a policy point of view, but also from an innovation point of view, that economics is now reaching the stage where we, just like other fields, there's the theory side, which is very important, but there's also the practical innovation side as well, and that the two are connecting with each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. That was very interesting, something different from what we've had. As we've reached our time limit, let me just thank you and hand it over to Charan.
Yes, Charan? I know. Yes, thank you so much. I know Professor has an appointment, and it's an important appointment which he cannot miss. So we will close here. But I want to thank the professor. As at Kennedy School and Harvard, when I heard you, Professor, simply excellent and extending the frontier, I must tell you, today's discussion is again extending the frontier. And I'm so impressed with the type of work that you're doing. And of course, it's going to be very useful for us. I have been also thinking, and I made a presentation both at the IMF and the World Bank, for having something like the MSME universities, where education and practical working in the informal sector is taught to the students so that they can generate employment as well as fight poverty. And this goes beyond the Muhammad Yunus lab, where only financial inclusion was discussed. So I'm so happy that you have discussed this, and I'm sure the participants are going to benefit from the ideas that you have given us. Even in our country, we have the venture fund, which the Small Industrial Development Bank of India and Government of India is setting up again and again and not getting not very successful. So therefore, I think your presentation today is going to benefit us at both the government level and at the policy level. I must thank you profusely for accepting our invitation and speaking to all of us today. I'm so thrilled that you have again spoken to us on the frontier, and that will again the academic participants who are joining us today and others who are joining us today are really going to benefit profusely for this. There are a number of questions that we have, but being aware of your appointment, which is due in next, I think, 7 minutes, we would now request you that can we have you once again on EGROW Foundation? And this time, we would like you to come when there is no appointment waiting, and we would like you to come and speak to us on basically digital, the platforms that you were mentioning and you're working on, the artificial intelligence, then machine learning, and digitalization, and how that's going to change the economy. We in our country, EGROW Foundation is actively involved with Niti Aayog to think of India in 25 years from today. And that is what the chairman was telling you. We have been thinking that a country like ours would be transformed with telemedicine, teleeducation, telebanking. And we would be so excited and we would be so happy if you could come and speak to us on those issues also. And with this, knowing that you have an appointment, we want to once again thank you profusely for spending time with us. This presentation that you've made with us today will be on our website in about 12 hours. We'll share the link with you and we'll also put it on Twitter because I know many more will benefit with your presentation today. I also want to thank the chairman for chairing the session today and all the participants today who have joined us. A large number of participants could join us. They were on the YouTube, but I was getting messages on my cell phone that they are still not able to log in. So I want to thank you and thank all the participants who have been with us today. An important announcement, Paul Milgrom, another Nobel laureate, is speaking to us on November 19. And India is into the process of monetizing of its assets under the national asset monetization. There's going to be bidding in that. And Paul Milgrom's presentation on auction is going to help us. So November 19 is Paul Milgrom. I would request and urge all of you to join. Next Friday, we have another very important talk. Should we be developing fast trains or should we be developing satellite towns? O.B. Agarwal, World Bank consultant, and now in India, is going to be leading that discussion. And Professor Geetam Tiwari is going to be the panelist in that discussion. I invite all of you to be part of that discussion. Once again, should we have fast trains or should we develop satellite towns? With this, finally, once again, coming back to the end of our program, Professor Michael, thank you very much for being with us. We hope to host you sometimes when your times are good and you are in India, and we want to request you to please consider our request to speak to us on digitalization and things like which involve technology in the process of development. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. And apologies for not allowing time for Q&A. Ran over, but thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.